Welcome to City Vision University's podcast, providing big summaries of books on rescue missions, city missions, and the Salvation Army. So imagine you are a counselor.
Okay, I'm with you.
A chronically depressed, severely alcoholic man walks into your office looking for help.
Right.
He's been in and out of jail. He's, stuck in this cycle of performative victimhood, and he's constantly threatening to end his own life.
A very tough case.
Exactly. So do you give him a warm hug and a cup of coffee, or do you look him dead in the eye and tell him to go jump off the nearest bridge and get it over with?
Wow. That sounds incredibly harsh.
It does. But today, we are looking at a man who actually did the latter. And miraculously, it saved the patient's life.
It sounds like absolute malpractice to our modern ears, doesn't it?
Oh, completely.
But that kind of aggressive, almost counterintuitive intervention, it's one piece of a much larger, incredibly complex puzzle we're looking at today.
It really is. Because today, we're opening up a remarkable time capsule. We're looking at a book published in 1952.
1952, right?
Yeah, and it's titled Soup, Soap, and Salvation, God's Changing Power. And this was compiled by a man named Pat B. Withrow.
A very interesting figure.
Very. And the mission of our deep dive today is to really extract the fascinating historical, sociological, and honestly deeply personal insights from this collection.
Right, because this isn't your typical polished history book.
Exactly. What we have here is this stack of raw, largely unedited testimonies from what the text calls twice-born men and women.
Twice born, meaning they had a massive spiritual and physical turnaround.
Yeah. According to the accounts in this book, these are individuals who passed through the Union Mission in Charleston, West Virginia at absolute rock bottom. The lowest of the low. And they found their lives completely transformed.
And we really need to understand what we're looking at here for you listening, because this isn't just a religious text or like a piece of mid-century inspirational literature. It functions as a primary source document. It captures the visceral, granular struggles of America's post-war, post-depression transient populations.
The people who had just completely fallen through the cracks.
Precisely. We are looking at the frontline methods used to rehabilitate people who had lost absolutely everything. It offers this incredibly detailed demographic snapshot of the destitute in the 1940s and 50s.
Right.
It looks at the psychological torment of addiction and guilt and the very practical grassroots mechanisms of social safety nets long before the advent of, modern state-sponsored clinical rehab.
Okay, let's unpack this, because the foundational philosophy of this entire operation is right there in the title. And it is led by a truly fascinating character.
Pat B. Withrow.
Yes, Pat B. Withrow. He is the founder and superintendent of this Union mission. And according to the foreword by a guy named Homer Roadheaver, Withrow built one of the world's greatest rescue missions in the exact same city where he formerly operated as a saloon keeper and a gambler.
I love that detail. It's the ultimate poacher-turned-gamekeeper story.
Oh, perfectly said.
He intimately knew the environment, right? He knew the temptations and the specific, crushing despair of the people he was now trying to help.
Because he used to profit from them.
Exactly. He profited from that exact same despair in that exact same city.
It makes me think of a modern analogy. It's like a former black hat hacker,
Oh, like someone who used to write malicious code.
Yeah. Someone who exploits vulnerabilities to break into secure financial networks, but then they suddenly turn their life around and build a top-tier, world-class cybersecurity firm.
Right, because they know how the bad guys think.
Exactly. The reason they're so incredibly good at defending the system is that they have a ground-level, street-smart understanding of exactly how the system breaks down. They know where the back doors are.
That is a perfect parallel.
Withrow wasn't some detached academic theorizing about poverty from an ivory tower. His past in the saloon gave him this uniquely gritty, empathetic understanding of the people walking through his mission doors.
He understood the architecture of their downfall. He knew exactly how a man rationalizes his third drink,
right,
or how a gambler convinces himself the next hand will absolutely win back his mortgage. And that practical street-level understanding translates directly into the mission's motto and operational sequence, which is soup, soap, and salvation.
Soup, soap, salvation.
The order of those words is not an accident. It is deeply intentional and, from a psychological and physiological standpoint, completely crucial.
Okay, I hear that, and I understand the soup part. Obviously, you have to feed people. But I want to push back on the sequence a little bit.
Okay, go for it.
If the ultimate goal of the mission is to permanently change a person's life trajectory, prioritizing a hot bath, the soap, over, say, getting them immediately into a job training program or giving them intensive counseling seems almost superficial at first glance.
I can see why it looks that way.
Right. Why was hygiene such a critical bottleneck?
That's a great question. And to answer it, we really have to look at the severe biological and psychological state these transient individuals were in when they arrived. If you look at this through the lens of human psychology, Withrow's sequence perfectly anticipates Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs.
Oh, right, which was only just becoming popularized in academic circles around this same era.
Exactly. You have a transient individual arriving in the mission. They are likely starving, sleep-deprived, and physically compromised by alcohol or just exposure to the elements.
Right. They are in pure survival mode.
Pure survival. When a human body is starting, the brain prioritizes basic survival functions. Cortisol levels are incredibly high.
Total biological panic.
Yes. The prefrontal cortex, which is the part of the brain responsible for complex decision-making, long-term planning, moral reflection, it is essentially severely suppressed.
Wow, so you literally cannot reason with them yet.
You physically cannot preach to a starving brain. The cognitive function required to reflect on one's life choices simply isn't there. Addressing those immediate physiological needs, the soup, is the absolute non-negotiable first step.
Stabilize the blood sugar first.
You have to stabilize the blood sugar and lower the biological panic before you can even have a rational conversation.
Okay, that makes total biological sense. But what about the soap? How does a bath change the brain chemistry?
The soap represents the restoration of basic human dignity, and that is a vital prerequisite for psychological intervention.
How so?
Think about the physical reality of the 1940s transient lifestyle. When you are covered in the literal grime of living on the streets or riding open freight trains across the country, breathing in coal dust, you internalize that exterior condition.
Oh, man.
Society looks at you with disgust, and eventually you adopt society's gaze as your own internal monologue. You feel subhuman.
You feel like garbage because you are treated like garbage. And eventually you just start acting like it.
Precisely. By providing a hot bath, a shave, and clean clothes, the mission was breaking that psychological feedback loop.
It's like a reset button.
It is. They were signaling to the individual, you are a human being, you have worth, and you deserve to be clean. It resets the individual's self-image.
That's powerful.
Only after the stomach is full, the biological panic is subdued, and the dignity is restored, do they introduce the salvation aspect. That's the ideological, emotional, and spiritual intervention.
They understood that you can't build a new worldview on a foundation of starvation and self-loathing.
Exactly.
I want you, the listener, to really think about this in the context of your own life. Think about a time you've tried to help someone, or maybe just tried to give some constructive advice to a friend or a colleague, when that person was simply exhausted.
Oh, it never goes well.
Right. Maybe they hadn't slept, or they were overwhelmed with stress, or they hadn't eaten all day. It's impossible. They're irritable, defensive, and completely closed off.
Hangry is a real psychological state.
It really is. You cannot reach the mind or the heart if the stomach is empty. The Union mission understood this profoundly simple truth and built an entire institution around it.
And once they addressed those physical barriers, they were able to tackle the mental and psychological barriers. This sequence allowed them to finally penetrate the internal narratives that people construct to justify their self-destruction.
Yes, and this is where we see the psychological mechanisms really start to unfold in the text, specifically in the story of E.A. Legg.
Ah, yes. E.A. Legg.
This testimony really jumped out at me because Legg articulates a defense mechanism that is so universally common, even today.
Very true.
Legg recounts how he called a business office in Charleston looking for a job and was directed by some kind person to go see Pat Withrow. In his testimony, Legg points out a fallacy that he used to believe deeply.
The victimless crime fallacy.
Exactly. He writes, and I'm paraphrasing here, like many people, I would say when I got too much to drink, well, I am not hurting anyone unless it's myself, and that's my business.
It is the ultimate fallacy of the victimless crime. It really is.
Hold on, let's define that in this specific context. How does cognitive dissonance actually protect a person who's actively destroying their own life?
Cognitive dissonance is the mental discomfort experienced by someone who holds two or more contradictory beliefs, ideas, or values.
Okay.
In Legg's case, he likely believed he was a fundamentally good, responsible person. But his actions, severe alcoholism, unreliability, contradicted that belief.
So his brain has to resolve that tension.
To resolve that intense discomfort, The brain constructs a protective wall of denial. Believing the delusion of isolation, the idea that you are only harming yourself, is a survival mechanism for the ego.
It protects him from feeling like the bad guy.
It allows the destructive behavior to continue without the crushing weight of immediate, unbearable guilt. If Legg admits his drinking is destroying his family, he has to face the fact that he is acting like a monster.
Wow.
By convincing himself it's a victimless crime, he can keep drinking.
But Legg eventually reaches a point of clarity at the mission where that wall comes down. He writes that he realized he hurt his wife, his friends, and other family members.
Yeah, he says he created wounds. He felt he would never have the opportunity on this earth to expiate.
The guilt is immense once that fiction is shattered.
And we see the true, tangible cost of those ripple effects in another testimony in the book, that of Margaret Campbell-Mann.
Oh, Margaret's story.
Her story serves as a devastating counterpoint to the idea of the victimless spiral.
It really does. It is heartbreaking, and it perfectly illustrates the collateral damage of addiction. She writes that she and her husband drifted into what she calls the things of the world.
Meaning they were partying, drinking, neglecting responsibilities.
Right. But then the unexpected happens. Her husband suddenly becomes ill and dies, leaving her with 2 small children and an absolute mountain of debt.
Overnight.
All their property, possessions, and so-called friends just vanish overnight.
The superficial social network they had built around their lifestyle completely collapsed the moment the money and the fun disappeared.
Exactly. And the most gut-wrenching part of her testimony, there was no provision left for her family, so her children had to be placed in an orphanage, and she was separated from them.
Just devastating.
The destruction didn't happen in a vacuum. It completely dismantled her family structure.
It destroyed the safety net for the entire next generation. And the text provides a very striking, visceral detail about Margaret that highlights the long-term biological consequences of these lifestyle choices.
What was that?
It notes that even 16 months after her conversion at the mission, 16 months after she had completely turned her life around, gotten sober, and entered full-time Christian work, she still showed the ravages of sin. Physically.
That detail stopped me in my tracks.
It's intense.
It's a stark reminder that while a mental or spiritual turnaround can happen in a moment of clarity, the physical toll of severe neglect, poverty, and substance abuse leaves deep, lasting scars.
The body keeps the score.
You don't just erase years of malnutrition and alcohol abuse with a few weeks of good behavior. Which makes me want to ask a deeper question here.
Go ahead.
Why do you think human beings are so quick to compartmentalize their self-destruction? I mean, why do we work so hard to convince ourselves that our actions happen in a vacuum, even when the evidence of the collateral damage, like losing your children to an orphanage, is staring us right in the face?
From a psychological perspective, acknowledging that your own pain is actively causing agonizing pain to the people you love is often too devastating a burden to bear on top of the addiction itself.
It's just too much shame.
Compartmentalization acts as a psychological tourniquet. If you admit that your actions are the direct reason your children are sleeping in an orphanage, the shame becomes totally intolerable. The ego would shatter.
So the mind just creates a fiction.
Exactly. This is my body, my life, my problem. Breaking through that fiction safely requires a highly specific environment where the individual feels they can face that overwhelming guilt without being utterly destroyed by it.
And that physical toll you just mentioned, the physical ravaging of the body, it perfectly explains why so many of these individuals are described in the text with such a specific, evocative phrase.
Human driftwood.
Yes, the book constantly refers to these transient populations as human driftwood. They had physically and socially eroded.
Just floating along.
They were the wanderers, the people who had lost all social tethers and were just pushed entirely by the currents of poverty and addiction. I want to look at the actual architecture of how someone becomes driftwood.
Okay.
And we have a perfectly documented case study in the testimony of a man named Mason Priest.
Mason Priest's trajectory is a classic sociological study of downward mobility triggered by severe unresolved trauma.
Exactly. And what's crucial to understand is that he wasn't born on the streets. He was a farm boy from Braxton County, West Virginia.
A completely normal upbringing.
He grew up with a family, worked hard, and had a relatively stable, good life until he was about 27 years old. He married a woman he deeply loved, but shortly after, she suddenly passed away.
Oh, man.
And according to his testimony, that is the definitive inflection point. That unresolved, catastrophic grief derails him completely.
It's a very common pattern. In an era before widely available grief counseling or trauma therapy, Individuals were entirely reliant on their own coping mechanisms.
And when those fail,
When those mechanisms fail, substances become the immediate, accessible anesthetic.
we can track his descent step by step. He tries to keep it together. He gets a job at the Hopemont Sanatorium, which was a tuberculosis hospital.
Right.
But the environment is stressful, and he starts drinking heavily to cope with the grief. He writes that he and his roommate would go out, get completely drunk, and sometimes the nurses would have to secretly put him to bed so the hospital administration wouldn't find out he was drinking on the job.
Which shows he was already operating in a state of high-functioning addiction.
He was being hidden by his peers.
He was relying entirely on the enabling behavior of his sympathetic coworkers to maintain his employment and the illusion of stability. But enabling, however well-intentioned, only delays the inevitable collapse.
And the collapse comes. He eventually loses that job. And that is when the drifting officially begins.
The real downward spiral.
Hitchhiking around the country. He talks about bumming around, stealing when he had to, going hungry for days. And here's a fascinating detail from his testimony that really speaks to the complex social dynamics of the era.
The part about where he slept.
Yes.
Yeah.
He mentions that during his lowest points, he ended up sleeping in colored churches when he couldn't find anywhere else to go.
That is a remarkable historical footnote, and we need to pause and examine the context of that.
Please do.
In the deeply segregated South and border states of the 1930s and 40s, racial lines were rigidly enforced, often violently.
Absolutely.
For a destitute white man to seek and find refuge in black churches speaks volumes about two things. First, it shows that the absolute lowest rungs of extreme poverty can temporarily erase certain rigid societal boundaries.
Because hunger and freezing temperatures don't care about segregation laws.
Exactly. And second, it simultaneously highlights the profound radical charity of marginalized black communities during that era.
That's such a good point.
These were congregations that had very little resources themselves, existing under the oppressive weight of Jim Crow, yet they offered sanctuary to a white man who had been cast out by his own community.
It's an incredible detail that adds so much texture to his journey. Eventually, the drifting brings him to Charleston. He doesn't know anyone. He doesn't know where to go.
He's totally lost.
He takes his father's watch, which he knows was probably his last remaining connection to his past, his family, his identity before the trauma.
His last anchor.
And he pawns it for survival money. He spends the day wandering the streets, eats some cheap donuts, drinks some water, and finally, utterly exhausted, ends up at the doors of the Union Mission.
He has hit the absolute floor.
But the upward climb from that floor is what I find so structurally interesting about the mission's methods.
Yes, because the rehabilitation they offer is not abstract or purely philosophical. It is deeply mechanical and tangible.
According to his account, he isn't just sat down in a pew and preached to while he's still reeling from the streets. He is sent to the industrial department of the mission and told to start baling paper.
Just balling scrap paper.
He specifically notes in his testimony, that was the first step up, for I had gone down as far as I could go. There is something incredibly grounding about manual labor when your life has been abstract chaos for years.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, what the Union Mission was doing through baling paper was providing a surrogate structure for individuals who had lost all their social and environmental tethers.
A surrogate structure, I like that.
Mason Priest had lost his wife, his job at the sanatorium, his home, and he had just severed his last familial tie by pawning his father's watch. He was completely untethered in the universe.
So the labor grounds him.
Baling paper isn't just busy work to pay for his soup. It functions as occupational therapy. It provides a schedule. It provides a tangible physical output. You can see the bale of paper you just created.
It's undeniably real.
It gives a sense of immediate, undeniable utility.
He also mentions the soup. After eating nothing but donuts and water, he says the mission soup tasted mighty good.
I bet it did.
The physical nourishment from a hot, hearty meal anchors him enough to finally absorb the spiritual component of the chapel service that night.
They were essentially reconstructing the scaffolding of a normal human life from the ground up.
Soup, soap, salvation in action.
The manual labor provides a schedule and purpose. The soup provides routine sustenance. The chapel provides a community and a moral framework. These deeply personal struggles of transient Americans in the 1950s map perfectly onto our universal, timeless human need for grounded community, biological stability, and a sense of purpose.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Because while some people, like Mason Priest, were drifting out of profound grief, others were drifting because they were running from something horrifying.
Right, the criminal element.
We have to talk about the story of Brady White. Reading his testimony in this 1952 book felt exactly like reading a script for a modern true crime documentary. The man spent 26 years on the run from a murder.
Brady White's testimony is undeniably one of the most gripping in the entire collection.
It really is.
Primarily because it deals with the agonizing psychological weight of a massive, unconfessed secret and the physical toll that kind of sustained paranoia takes on a human being.
The details of his early life are incredible and tragic. Brady writes that he left his uncle's farm at the age of 12 to go work in a mining camp. 12 years old.
Barely a child.
He describes himself as strong and wiry, doing a full-grown man's work in the mines. In this incredibly harsh camp environment, he meets an older vagabond named Big Joe Benda.
A classic bad influence.
Benda fills this impressionable 12-year-old's head with romantic, thrilling stories of traveling the country, riding freight trains, living free, and never paying a cent for a ticket. The classic American hobo mythos.
Right.
So Brady leaves the mines to see the world. He eventually partners up with a guy named Curly, and they start supporting their transient lifestyle by mugging people.
Just petty theft, highway robbery.
They'd wait in the dark, hit guys over the head, take their money, and run. It was pretty brutal, but for them, it was just business. But then comes the fatal night in Ashland, Kentucky.
The turning point.
They stalk a man named George McKnight down by the river. They strike him, rob him, and leave him lying in the dirt, fully assuming he'll just wake up with a severe headache the next morning.
He doesn't wake up.
No, he doesn't. 2 days later, Brady and Curly are hanging out in a pool room, and they overhear some locals talking about a brutal murder down by the river.
Oh, wow.
Curly manages to get his hands on a local newspaper, and Brady describes watching the blood completely drain from Curly's face as he reads it. George McKnight died from the blow to the head.
It wasn't just a mugging anymore.
And the paper reveals the devastating human context. McKnight wasn't just some random guy with cash. He was the sole financial support of a widowed mother. And that very night, he'd been calling on his fiancée in Coal Grove, Ohio, across the river.
He had a whole life.
In an instant, Brady's entire self-conception shatters. He isn't just a tough guy mugger anymore. He is a murderer who has completely destroyed a family.
And this initiates what is essentially a multi-decade fugue state. A life defined entirely by flight.
26 years.
Brady doesn't just run from the police jurisdiction. He is attempting to run from his own mind.
He describes the immediate aftermath with terrifying clarity. They flee across the Ohio River. Curly, likely terrified of being implicated, abandons him. Brady is entirely alone.
So isolating.
He hops a freight train heading out west, deep into the night. And he writes that every single time he tried to close his eyes and go to sleep in that boxcar, he could see George McKnight's face staring back at him.
The guilt just immediately takes over.
He writes, I could hear the ghastly sound of wood against bone, the sound of his skull being crushed by my blow. He begins experiencing severe, relentless auditory hallucinations born out of pure trauma and unbearable guilt.
The human brain is not equipped to process the sudden realization that it has taken an innocent life without severe psychological fracturing.
It just broke his brain.
Those auditory hallucinations, the sound of wood against bone looping endlessly, are a manifestation of severe PTSD and a conscience that cannot integrate the horror of its own actions.
He rides the rails all the way to San Francisco. He lives in a state of total paranoia, convinced that every single police officer he sees on the street is specifically looking for him. The sheer exhaustion of that must have been crushing.
He could never relax.
He eventually bounces back to Missouri, teams up with another hardened criminal named Shorty, and they start doing highly dangerous armed stick-ups on the Kansas City and Southern Railroad.
The escalarity, the violence.
It becomes a life of pure chaos, adrenaline, and violence, all serving as a desperate distraction, trying to outrun that sound of wood against bone echoing in his head. This goes on for 26 years.
Which brings up a profound psychological and philosophical question. We have to analyze the timeline here.
Okay, let's look at it.
After 26 years of transience, changing names, and moving across the country, the trail for a random mugging-turned-murder in Ashland, Kentucky is completely cold.
It's ice cold.
Brady White is, for all practical intents and purposes, completely safe from the law. The police are no longer actively hunting a transient for a decades-old crime by the river.
Right.
So why, after successfully escaping justice for over a quarter of a century, does he finally break down at the Union mission in Charleston and confess to a murder that could very easily send him to the electric chair?
It seems completely counterintuitive to the basic human survival instinct. I mean, if you got away with it, why open your mouth?
It is entirely counterintuitive unless you understand the corrosive, inescapable nature of unconfessed guilt.
It just eats away issue.
The burden of carrying a secret of that magnitude, of hiding your true nature from every single person you meet, acts as a psychological prison that is far more torturous than any physical cell constructed of iron and concrete.
That makes sense.
Think about his daily reality. He was trapped in a state of hypervigilance for 9,490 days.
Every single day looking over his shoulder.
The sheer biological exhaustion of maintaining that secret, of never being able to form a single genuine human connection because you are constantly hiding your true identity and your darkest action, eventually outweighs the primal fear of punishment.
The isolation must have been absolute. Even when he was with other people, he was completely alone with what he had done.
Exactly. The physical threat of the electric chair actually became less daunting, less terrifying to him than the endless internal waking nightmare of his own conscience.
Wow.
When he finally arrived at the Union mission, the environment, an environment entirely predicated on absolute unburdening radical confession and the promise of forgiveness, offered him a release valve he desperately needed.
He just couldn't carry it anymore.
The desire for psychological peace finally superseded the desire for biological survival.
It's the ultimate proof that you can successfully outrun the law, you can outrun the police, but you cannot outrun yourself.
Yeah.
And it required a very specific kind of environment for him to finally feel safe enough to stop running.
It did.
Which leads us to the actual interpersonal methods used by Pat Withrow and his staff at the mission. Because we've talked about the soup and the soap, but they weren't just offering warm smiles, gentle pats on the back, and a bowl of broth.
Oh, absolutely not.
Sometimes their methods for breaking through these psychological prisons were highly unorthodox, deeply confrontational, and honestly, to our modern ears, a bit jarring.
You're referring to the concept of shock therapy, or what we would clinically call paradoxical intervention and interpersonal counseling.
Exactly. Let's look at the story of Harry Wares, which I teased at the very beginning of the show.
A bridge story.
Yes. According to the text, Harry was a guy who bounced around Charleston, constantly in and out of the local jail for writing bad checks and severe public drunkenness. He was a familiar face to the authorities.
A frequent flyer.
Withrow, in his capacity as the mission superintendent, used to go down to the jail to visit him. The cycle was always the same. Harry would get out of jail, go straight to the mission, get his free food and shelter, express sorrow for his actions, and then almost immediately walk out the door, write another bad check, and get blackout drunk again.
Classic addictive loop.
He was trapped in a relentless cycle of profound self-pity and emotional manipulation. He was using the mission's charity to sustain his addiction.
He had weaponized his own helplessness.
Yes. So one day, Harry comes back to the mission to see Withrow, half drunk again, likely expecting the usual routine of sympathy and a free meal.
Naturally.
And instead of giving him a gentle, forgiving sermon, Withrow uses heavy, cutting irony. He looks at Harry, this depressed, alcoholic man, and says, "Harry, you would do us all a favor if you would go down to the bridge on Elk River and jump in. End it all."
It's just staggering to hear that. To our modern sensibilities, a trained counselor or a mission leader looking at a depressed, chemically dependent man and explicitly telling him to go jump off a bridge is unthinkable.
It really is.
It sounds cruel, and frankly, it sounds like a massive liability and malpractice.
Absolutely.
But we have to deeply analyze the calculated risk Withrow was taking in that specific moment with that specific individual. Withrow recognized that Harry was trapped in a cycle of performative victimhood.
Explain the mechanics of that. I mean, how does telling him to jump off a bridge strip away his rebellion? What is paradoxical intention?
Paradoxical intention is a technique later formalized and popularized by the psychiatrist Viktor Frankl.
Okay.
The premise is that when a patient is stuck in an erotic cycle, in Harry's case, constantly threatening self-destruction to elicit sympathy and care from others, you actively encourage the negative behavior.
You just agree with them.
You agree with the patient's most catastrophic assessment of themselves. Harry expected Withrow to beg him to live, to coddle him, to tell him he was special and worth saving.
Because that coddling was the emotional fuel Harry fed on.
By leaning entirely into Harry's nihilism and essentially calling his bluff, saying, "You know what? You're right. You're a burden. Go jump off the bridge." Withrow completely short-circuited Harry's expectations.
He removed the audience.
Precisely. He removed the audience for Harry's slow, performative suicide. He forced the individual to confront the stark, unvarnished reality of their own nihilism without the buffer of sympathy.
Which is terrifying.
Withrow, utilizing his street smarts from his saloon days, intuited that Harry didn't actually want to die. He just wanted to be coddled while he slowly destroyed himself.
So calling his bluff forced his hand.
By telling him to just get it over with, he forced Harry into a binary choice: actually die or finally choose life and take responsibility.
Harry specifically notes in his testimony that he walked out of the mission completely stunned, wondering what Withrow meant by that remark.
I bet he was stunned.
He says the shock of it stuck with him, rattled around in his brain, until it finally broke through his alcoholic haze and he saw real permanent change. It was a massive gamble by Withrow, but it shows how intuitively he understood the street-level psychology of addiction.
And it demonstrates a crucial tenet of effective rehabilitation. It cannot be a monolith. A one-size-fits-all approach fails because human trauma is not one-size-fits-all. Different keys unlock different doors.
Right, because it wasn't just shock therapy through harsh words. Sometimes the shock therapy was purely intellectual.
Oh, the Zeoli sermon.
Yes, the book briefly mentions an unidentified man whose turning point wasn't a bowl of soup or a harsh rebuke, but a highly complex theological sermon by an evangelist named Anthony Zeoli.
Do we know the sermon's name?
The sermon was titled Law and Grace, the Difference. According to the man's account, this sermon intellectually outlined the concept of God's long-suffering in a way that simply broke his heart. It bypassed his emotional defenses entirely and dismantled his worldview using pure logic.
Which reinforces the point. For Mason Priest, the key to unlocking his recovery was baling paper and physical labor.
For Brady White, the key was an environment safe enough to unburden a terrible secret.
For Harry Wares, it was a harsh, paradoxical slap of reality to break his self-pity.
And for others, it was an intellectual framework that finally provided a rational meaning for their suffering. The mission's success lay in its ability to deploy a wide array of interventions.
Tailoring the approach to the individual.
Exactly. Once those different interventions worked, once that shock therapy broke their nihilism or the labor grounded their grief, the immediate question became, what happens next?
Right, reintegration.
You can't just shatter someone's worldview, get them sober, and leave them in a vacuum. You have to rebuild their social grid. Let's look at the incredible societal restorations documented in the book because the tangible results are staggering.
They really are.
Take the story of Cecil L. Taylor. His testimony is practically cinematic. Cecil had been completely disowned by his family due to his drinking and behavior. His own brother had looked him in the eye and told him he never wanted to see him again.
Total alienation.
Cecil hits absolute, definitive rock bottom in the middle of the night, sobbing uncontrollably on his mother's grave in a cemetery in North Carolina. He writes that he's overwhelmed by the agonizing remorse of how his actions had broken his mother's heart before she died.
The imagery of the cemetery scene is incredibly potent. It is a powerful motif of hitting a literal dead end. There is nowhere lower to go than crying on a grave in the pitch black, entirely cut off from the living, mourning the relationships you actively destroyed.
From that cemetery, an old man directs him to seek out Pat Withrow in Charleston. Cecil travels to the mission, accepts the help, goes through the process, and undergoes a massive transformation. And then the text describes this incredible moment a few weeks later.
This is a great scene.
Withrow is sitting in his front office on a Saturday afternoon, looking out the window, and a massive, beautiful Cadillac pulls up to the mission doors. Out step 3 ladies and 2 men. It's Cecil's sisters and brothers-in-law.
They came to find him.
They had heard rumors about his change and drove down to find him. Withrow writes that they didn't even have to be told their brother was a different person. They knew it the very second they laid eyes on him.
The physical transformation.
A physical transformation from the rugged, starving, broken man in the cemetery to the clean, sober man standing before them was instantaneous proof. And what's amazing is that Cecil and his wife Janie didn't just go back to a quiet life. They actually went on to superintend their own rescue mission in a distant city.
What stands out to you in that story?
It's the immediate, seamless reconnection to the family unit. Notice how transformation in these stories doesn't happen in isolation. The moment Cecil is rehabilitated, he isn't just sent out to live alone in a cheap apartment to fight his demons by himself. He is instantly reintegrated into his family structure, and then he immediately transitions into a life of service, running his own mission to help others.
It beautifully illustrates a core truth of recovery. The opposite of addiction isn't just sobriety, it is connection. The mission served as a vital conduit to plug these untethered individuals back into the social grid.
So true.
And what is perhaps most remarkable, especially when you consider this as a document compiled in 1952, is how incredibly broad and egalitarian that grid was.
I'm so glad you brought that up because the diversity in these testimonies is really striking for the era. The book profiles Bill and Alberta Stanton. Bill was a fatherless, homeless African-American boy from Leavenworth, Kansas.
Right.
He found his way to the mission, and through the help of Withrow and a woman named Mrs. Carrie Jackson, he was given a safe place to stay, clothed, and sent to school to get an education.
A huge opportunity in that era.
You also have the testimony of William Spencer, a Native American boy who wandered into Charleston penniless and freezing. He found a home at the mission, learned a highly skilled trade as an expert painter, and eventually became a respected advisor and supervisor in a boys' school.
We have to view this through the historical lens of the America of 1952. Societal divisions based on race and class were deeply entrenched, culturally normalized, and in many places, legally codified.
Yeah, Jim Crow was still the law in many places.
Yet, within the walls of the Union Mission in West Virginia, we see a fascinating microcosm of radical egalitarianism. Addiction, deep grief, crushing poverty, and sin are universal levelers. They absolutely do not discriminate.
They hit everyone.
The text shows that the mission's doors were open to everyone, creating a unique environment where a homeless African-American youth, a destitute Native American, a former wealthy bootlegger, and an ex-vaudeville stage actress were all treated with the exact same foundational sequence of soup, soap, and salvation.
Speaking of the bootlegger, that was Charlie Justice.
Yeah.
His story adds a bit of dark Appalachian humor to the book.
He had a great quote.
He was apparently a very well-known, unlearned man who used to owe money to literally everyone in town from his illegal activities. He joked in his testimony that when he was a sinner, he'd walk down the main street of Charleston and have to constantly cross back and forth across the street just to dodge all the people he owed money to.
A stressful way to live.
When he finally got saved at the mission and went straight, he humorously announced to his friends that his lard arrived by water.
It's a colorful colloquialism, but beneath the humor, it underscores the sheer exhausting relief of dropping the constant low-grade anxiety of a criminal lifestyle. You no longer have to look over your shoulders.
Exactly.
And you mentioned the vaudeville actress, Mildred Gorseman. Her inclusion is fascinating because she represents a completely different demographic. She wasn't a farm boy or a bootlegger. She was someone who had tasted significant worldly success.
She had it all.
She was touring the country, hearing the applause of crowds, making money, but she writes that she found herself completely hollowed out when her 18-year-old sister suddenly died.
Just a tragic loss.
She describes sitting in her glamorous dressing room in San Francisco, entirely surrounded by the trappings of success, but completely devoid of any comfort, meaning, or foundational grounding.
From farm boys sleeping in train cars to bootleggers dodging debts to stage actresses crying in dressing rooms, they all ended up sitting in the exact same wooden seats at the mission chapel.
It's incredible.
And that leads us to the ultimate outcome of these stories. The final piece of the puzzle, the generational ripple effect, because these twice-born individuals didn't just get sober and quietly live out their days in obscurity. They became active, powerful agents of change in their own right.
This is where we see the compounding interest of social good.
I like that phrasing.
When an institution successfully rehabilitates an individual, you are not merely saving one isolated biological life. You are fundamentally altering the trajectory of their entire family tree and sending shockwaves through their wider community.
The prime example in the text is Jimmy Stroud. Withrow gets a phone call from a prominent businessman in Memphis, Tennessee, named T. Walker Lewis. Okay. Lewis sees the poverty in his own city, wants to start a rescue mission in Memphis, and asks Withrow to send him someone qualified to run it. Withrow doesn't send a polished academic. He sends Jimmy Stroud, one of his own rehabilitated men who knew the streets.
He sent someone who lived it.
According to the text, Jimmy goes down there, and within 4 hours of his interview with Lewis, the Memphis Union Mission is born. It grows so fast and so effectively that the locals start calling it the Miracle of Memphis, and Jimmy Stroud is later voted most outstanding young man in Memphis by the local Rotary Club.
Think about the sociological mechanics of that turnaround. A man who was previously entirely dependent on the charity of others to survive, a man who was deemed a burden by society, is transformed into a highly respected civic leader recognized by the Rotary Club.
It's a total 180.
And establishing a massive institution that will go on to feed, shelter, and rehabilitate thousands of other people. The intervention scales exponentially.
We see that scaling effect on the microscopic family level, too. The book mentions men like J.C. Farley, who had 6 children, and E.S. Bumpus, who had 2 daughters.
Real families involved here.
When the mission intervened and saved J.C. Farley, it didn't just save J.C. Farley. It ensured that those 6 children grew up with a present, sober, employed father instead of navigating the severe trauma of an addicted, absent parent.
That changes everything.
It changed the statistical probability of those 6 children ending up in poverty, relying on state welfare, or entering the prison system themselves.
It is the literal breaking of generational curses. And we have the clinical terminology to explain why this is so critical today.
What's the term?
The sociological data on adverse childhood experiences, commonly referred to as ACEs, tells us that children raised in chaotic households, specifically households with severe substance abuse, neglect, or parental incarceration, experience physical changes in their brain development.
Well, it alters the brain.
High ACC scores are directly correlated with significantly higher probabilities of chronic health issues, from heart disease to severe depression, and a much higher likelihood of perpetuating the cycle of addiction.
So it's a physical cycle as much as a social one.
By interrupting the cycle in the father, the mission wasn't just performing a spiritual intervention, they were acting as a massive preventative public health measure for the children.
So what does this all mean? We have journeyed through a lot today. We started with the foundational, fiercely practical philosophy of soup, soap, and salvation. We analyzed the biological necessity of feeding the starving brain before preaching to it.
We did.
We walked through the harrowing true crime nightmares of men like Brady White outrunning the sound of murder, and the psychological shock therapy used on men like Harry Wares. We saw the cinematic family reunions of Cecil Taylor, and finally we tracked the massive, compounding generational impact of these rescue missions, changing family trees forever.
It is a remarkable journey. And it is important, as we synthesize all of this information, to maintain our analytical stance. The text we are analyzing frames every single one of these transformations, explicitly and unapologetically through the lens of divine Christian intervention. The testimonies attribute the healing directly to the miraculous power of God.
Yes, that is the core of their testimonies.
But as analysts examining the text, even if we stepped entirely outside of that specific theological framework, the sociological and psychological mechanisms at play here, community integration, structured occupational therapy, addressing immediate physiological needs, breaking the cycle of unconfessed guilt, and providing a transcendent purpose, are undeniably powerful, empirically sound frameworks for human rehabilitation.
The methods work on a deeply, universally human level, providing immediate physiological care to lower cortisol, offering a highly structured environment through baling paper to rebuild a routine, utilizing a diverse community as a social anchor.
Providing a safe space to confess hidden traumas.
Exactly, and giving the individual a purpose that extends far beyond their own daily survival. Those are the fundamental building blocks of recovery, regardless of the era, the decade, or the specific vocabulary you use to describe it.
Withrow and his staff recognized intuitively what science continually proves, that a human being is a profoundly complex integration of body, mind, and spirit, or, in secular terms, physiology, psychology, and purpose.
The 3 pillars.
If you ignore any one of those 3 pillars, the entire structure collapses. You cannot treat the mind while the body starves, and you cannot heal the body if the mind is devoid of purpose.
Which brings me to a final provocative thought I want to leave you, the listener, with today. We live in a modern era where addiction treatment has become highly, almost exclusively medicalized.
Very true.
We have sophisticated clinical therapy, sanitized residential facilities, advanced pharmacological interventions to ease withdrawal, and sleek apps on our phones to track our daily habits and moods, all of which, to be clear, are incredible, life-saving scientific advancements.
Absolutely essential tools.
But looking back at this raw, gritty 1952 document, we have to ask ourselves, what is lost when we remove the tight-knit, community-driven, and highly personal, messy, soup, soap, and soul approach to recovery?
It's a great question.
Can a clinical app tracking your dopamine levels or a sterile waiting room with fluorescent lights ever truly replicate the raw, redemptive power of a safe haven that offers a hot bowl of soup, a hot bath, and someone sitting across the table who intimately knows your darkest secrets and truly, fiercely believes you can be born again. Something to mull over. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.